If you read Article 1, Section 2 of the Constitution on the day that it was written, you might notice something unusual about the text. It reads, "Representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned among the several states which may be included within this Union, according to their respective numbers, which shall be determined by adding the whole number of free persons, including those bound to service for a term of years, and excluding Indians not taxed, 3/5 of all other persons." You might wonder, who are these other persons, and why do they only count for 3/5 of a person? This unusual line of text is known as the Three-Fifths Compromise. It no longer exists within our Constitution and was repealed by the 13th Amendment, ratified in 1865, which abolished slavery. Even though the words slave and slavery never appear in this section or in the Constitution at all, the Three-Fifths Compromise is entirely to do with slavery. To understand why it is there, let's journey back imaginatively into the year of 1787, when the Constitution was written and presented to the states for ratification. Remember, the United States as we know it today did not yet exist. The Articles of Confederation had established a firm league of friendship between the states, but not much of a federal or central government. The new Constitution needed to work for all of the states, or else they would not ratify it and join the new United States. The country at the time was not neatly divided into free states in the North and slave states in the South, like it later was. Slavery was legal throughout much of the country, including northern states like New York that would eventually become free. Although you can see that slavery was already beginning to become an institution of the South more so than in the North. Results from the first census in 1790 show that the southern state with the lowest population of enslaved people still had more slaves than the northern state with the highest number. Furthermore, the percentage of enslaved people compared to free people was higher in every southern state. As a result, the framers of the Constitution had to consider the interests of slave owners, and particularly Southern slave owners. It is important to realize that the Three-Fifths Compromise wasn't saying that enslaved persons, in fact, only counted as 3/5 of a person. In fact, they didn't count as people at all. In the 1857 Dred Scott case, the Supreme Court would affirm that, according to the Constitution, enslaved persons held the same status as property. Elsewhere in the Constitution, the capture and return of escaped slaves would be regarded the same as the return of stolen property. Antebellum America was built on the idea of white supremacy, and its Constitution, as originally written, reflects that. Enslaved people were closer to the status of their masters' horses than their masters themselves. The Three-Fifths Compromise itself is not asserting the partial humanity of enslaved people, however. The Constitution was not even that generous. If we reread the text of the Three-Fifths Compromise again, it refers to how representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned among the several states. In other words, it describes how the population of a state would be counted to determine the number of congressmen in the House of Representatives, the number of votes the state will have in the Electoral College, and how the federal tax burden of states will be calculated. It means that of every 5 enslaved persons, 3 of those people would be counted when determining representation in Congress. Now you might wonder, why 3/5? Why not half or even 3/4? 3/5 seems kind of random. Here it's helpful to look at how representatives were assigned to each state, if enslaved people were counted, and if enslaved people were not counted at all. When the Constitution was written, a state gained a representative for each 30,000 people in its population. Clearly, more representatives would mean more power in the new Congress, as well as the Electoral College, so states would want to ensure that as many people in their state were counted, so that they could have the most representation and the most power as possible. As a result, we end up with a scenario that might seem, at first glance, the opposite of what you'd expect. States with a high population of enslaved people wanted those slaves to count as a full person. People opposed to slavery, however, didn't think that slaves, who were not considered citizens and certainly did not have the right to vote, to count at all. But again, remember that we are not talking about acknowledging the humanity of enslaved people here. We are talking about the method used to count the population and determine a state's power in Congress. In this case, fully acknowledging the humanity of enslaved people by counting them fully as people would make it harder to rid the country of slavery. Let's do the math. Here is the population of the United States in 1790, based on the first census taken in that year. Each heart in the diagram represents 30,000 people, or one representative in Congress. Red hearts are enslaved people, while blue hearts are free. If we don't count enslaved people at all, you see here the North ends up with a clear advantage over the South, with 15 more representatives than in the South. Next, let's try counting enslaved people as a whole person, just like if they were free citizens. Now the South ends up with the advantage, 4 additional representatives. When you consider that in 1790, about a third of the population of the South was enslaved, that made a free person's vote in the South count for more than a vote did in the North. Even leaving slavery aside, this was clearly not ideal for people living in free states. Remember, too, that those extra congressmen translated into extra votes in the Electoral College, giving the South more power than the North in the presidential election as well. If the North hoped to hold political power, it could not support counting enslaved persons fully. From this, we end up with the 3/5 compromise. Now let's try the same exercise again, now assuming that each of those enslaved people counts for only 3/5 of a person, while figuring out congressional representation and the Electoral College. The North ends up with 51 representatives in Congress, and the South ends up with 50. This is much more balanced. The 3/5 compromise was one of the ways that the Constitution ended up ratified by all 13 states at the time, slave and free, Northern and Southern. However, it did set up a system that gave a political edge to states with high populations of enslaved people. It's important to remember that the North had over 500,000 more free people than the South, yet only has 1 additional representative in Congress. Enslaved people could not vote, but the existence of their enslaved bodies within the states had the effect of giving their master's vote a greater effect than the same vote cast in a free state. The 3/5 compromise is also the first of what would become many examples of compromising on, rather than confronting, the issue of slavery. As the 19th century progressed and the country became more divided, tensions over the issue of slavery seemingly couldn't be solved by the political process or in the courts, causing the matter to eventually boil over into rebellion, secession, and civil war.